Hi, Judy. My name is Karen Nussbaum. I was born in Chicago in 1950.
And what was your life like before you would say you learned about or got involved in the women's movement?
Well, I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in a Chicago suburb and, you know, almost entirely white with enlightened Jewish, although not religious parents. And, hated life and, was tormented by how bad things were in the world. And then I went to college, and that was awesome because you could do anything you wanted. And I became very politically active at that time. I went to Cuba to cut sugarcane with the Vence Ramos Brigade in 1970. And then when I came back, I moved to Boston and threw myself into the women's movement then.
Okay. How did you learn about the women's movement in Boston?
Well, it was just everywhere. There must have been 1,000 local little women's organizations. So, for example, my roommates and I started one. Everybody had one or two that they started in the early 1970s. Ours was called Female Revolutionary Education, and we taught auto mechanics, street medicine, and silk screening, which nobody even knows what that is anymore. But it was how we
I
used to
do.
make it's how we used to make posters, and then we put them up all over the place. So,
Uh-huh.
but I was also part of a women's karate class, and when I would go to my job on Wednesdays, I carried in my tote bag a brick that was wrapped in rope because part of our women's karate class was to toughen up our knuckles by pounding our fists into bricks.
Oh my goodness.
And then I had another little women's group where our job was to, self-appointed, was to write up anti-war comic strips using little Lulu as the protagonist. And then we'd silk screen them or mimeograph them, and then we'd pass them out on street corners, but they were designed for women as well.
I see. So you did recruit women to your various classes and activities?
Yeah, sure. But the most important thing that happened was that I had to get a job. I had to pay the rent and so on. And so I got the job that was most typical for women in those days, and that was as a clerical worker. And I came to realize after some time that I could be organizing on the job. It was all women. Everybody was quietly seething. And those of us who were activists knew how to call a meeting. And so that's how we started 9 to 5.
What were you seething about?
Oh, the petty injustices. We didn't even have the knowledge to be angry about our pay. We thought, oh, this is a step up from factory work, for example. But I had a friend who was working in an office, and her initials were MA, and her coworkers her initials were AM. And in those days, you typed a letter for your boss, and you put, at the bottom of the letter, you put the boss's initials in capitals with a backslash, and then your initials in lowercase. And her boss could not remember the names of either of these two women or which one was which because their initials were similar. I had a student who walked into the office one day and looked me dead in the eye and said, "Isn't anybody here?" As if
You were invisible.
exactly. And we were invisible. We were, there were 20 million of us, but we were like the wallpaper.
Well, you say until we started 9 to 5 very casually. Please tell the people in the future about 9 to 5, what your original goals were,
Sure.
etc.
Yeah. So the idea for 9 to 5 started really as I walked a picket line for a group of waitresses who had decided to unionize. They worked in one little restaurant called Cronin's. This was in Cambridge Square, and they just got fed up by, getting patted on the butt or not getting their tips or, whatever it was that put them over the edge. And so these 8 women created their own union, which they called the Harvard Square Waitresses Organizing Committee. Now, they had no idea about power, but they did have a big idea about anger. And so they created this little union, and the women's movement came out to support them. And every Wednesday night I had picket duty. And that was when this idea came to me that you could organize women, not just in general, but you could organize them in relation to their bosses. And that was a way to exercise power that could yield both substantial results and took it out of the realm of just the personal. So that you didn't have to just be fighting for either legal changes or to get respect from your husband or boyfriend, but for structural changes in the economy through your relationship to the boss. And so it was that idea that percolated for some time. We created an organization where I worked, which was at Harvard, which we called the Harvard Office Workers Committee, which met and didn't know very much about what to do either, but met. And then we expanded it out to a group of 10 of our friends who were all working as clericals, some in insurance, some in hospitals, all different kinds of workplaces. And over about a year or so, we came to this idea of creating a citywide organization for women office workers. We produced a newsletter, and we would hand it out in front of subway and bus stops as people walked into work. And with that, we held our first meeting at the YWCA in downtown Boston, and 150 women showed up. It was phenomenal. Yeah. And from there, it just took off.
And so 2 questions. One is, what was the original goal, and how did you come up with the name?
Well, the goal was, what was the goal? The goal was to rights and respect for women office workers. That's what the goal was. That was our slogan. But what was more important was the method. It was to organize women as workers and to make our demands in relation to the workplace, and that we would see where we could gain the most traction, and that we would also be driven, the demands would be driven by the members. The name actually came from a popular 1950s comic strip called 9 to 5. And it was a stupid, overbearing boss, sexy secretary thing. But the point was that we weren't creating an organization called Women Workers of the World Unite. We were creating you didn't have to feel anything about this. You didn't need to come with a political line. This was open for anybody. And so we were just going to call it after the normal hours of the workday for women office workers. Mm-hmm. And then that was part of what it represented our approach, which was, don't make your words be the enemy of your ideas. Build a mass organization that's really open to everybody, that gives people experiences that move them, doesn't set up rhetorical barriers.
Can you talk about some early efforts, some early skirmishes or early victories?
Sure. We the very first thing we did was to call a meeting with the head of the Chamber of Commerce. So he came to this meeting, and we, I think, 50 women came to this meeting. We probably announced it at the first meeting that we would do this follow-up. And he came to the meeting, and then we demanded a meeting with the entire Chamber of Commerce. And then we never heard back from him. Or maybe he said, we need to see some statistics. So we thought, statistics. We never, it hadn't occurred to us.
Do that.
So we looked up some stuff, and it made us even more mad. That's when we found out that we were such a massive part of the workforce. I mean, at the time, the popular view of the typical American worker was a man in a hard hat. But in fact, the biggest sector of the workforce was women office workers, was clerical workers.
Really?
But no one would have guessed that. And there was not a single representation of us in popular media. The last time there'd been anyone in popular media had been like Della Street on Perry Mason. You know?
Right.
But, and that's also when we found out that, in fact, while office workers thought we were, you know, had fancier jobs than factory workers, in fact, factory workers made more than we did. That we may have dressed up to go to work, but they took home more pay, which, you know, now we understand, or not soon after, we understood SAM was a function of being in a union as opposed to being, you know, this highly exploitable workforce of largely, you know, of this wave of new women workers. So that was one example, and going after the representatives and realizing that we needed more tools to actually extract anything from them. But over the years, what we did then was we created committees by industry. And so we had a publishing committee, and our members then went on to sue 6 different publishing houses and win in every single publishing house. Or we attacked the insurance industry for low pay. And we had insurance companies like John Hancock, because they were or Liberty Mutual, where we did big campaigns that were very public campaigns, which ultimately raised pay for the women, sometimes by 10%, created new avenues for women to become managers and so on. We brought an Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, an OFCCP suit, federal government suit against National City Bank. And we did it with a lot of, took those kinds of actions with a lot of banks. And we're on the way to making big gains when, who must it have been? Reagan came in 1980, and we get a secret call from the OFCCP saying we're being pressured to drop the case. But we made, so we made real gains for women, but we also had this massive effect on the way women workers throughout, but especially women office workers, saw ourselves as agents of our own lives and of change in the economy over those years. The idea, over the years, I would meet women from Texas or New Hampshire, or, you know, places that we had never been, who would say, "Oh, 9 to 5, yeah, that was really important to me. You know, I would talk about that with my friends," and that was happening all over the place.
So you did have members from all over the country.
Well, then ultimately we had our first chapter was in Boston. In some other places, women's organizations were growing that were focused on clerical workers were growing up in other places like New York or San Francisco, Chicago. And then over time, we also helped create another 15, 20 organizations. And almost all of those came under the umbrella of 9 to 5, which was also called the National Association of Working Women, something like that. Yeah, I think it was called that. Anyway, so we had a big national organization with chapters in a lot of places. And then, of course, this was all propelled even more with the movie 9 to 5. So the movie 9 to 5 came out of my friendship with Jane Fonda. Oh. I had been very active in the anti-war movement, and starting in 72 through 75, I was part of the Indochina Peace Campaign, which was the organization that Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden created at a time when a lot of people thought that the war was winding down, but it wasn't. And so we had become good friends while there. And then when the war ended in 75, Jane wanted to restart her career as an actress. And she had heard me talk about all this organizing that I'd been doing with women workers. And it was her idea to make a movie 2 or 3 years later. So we helped her both with you know, writing a pitch letter to the studio, and most importantly, she and the writers came to meet with about 40 of our members in Cleveland one night to talk with them about, you know, what work was like and what made them angry and so on. And at one point they asked, have you ever dreamed of getting even with the boss? And that is what really blew the roof off of the meeting. And it was, those stories are the stories that are in the movie. And that's why the movie is so successful, because it wasn't some writer making up what they thought women were experiencing or feeling or thinking. It was the women themselves. And so it was a huge success. And because it was a farce, and it was kind of like 9 to 5 itself, you didn't have to come in wanting to, you know, go to a movie that was going to educate you about work. This wasn't going to be a drama. This wasn't going to be something that you had to already have an opinion about. This was going to be a comedy. Right. And you walked in, you know, probably with your boyfriend, and you were in stitches, and he's wondering what's going on. And you walk out thinking, oh yeah, that, you know, those attitudes toward women, that is outrageous. And so what had been a question before, is there discrimination in the workforce, became a ludicrous, how could you even question it? And so it completely changed the debate. And now it became just a question of what you were going to do about it. Mm-hmm. And so right around that time, then we started our own union, because what we saw we could accomplish with 9 to 5 as an association was this massive change of public opinion, and these fights that could make incidental changes, some of them very significant, but no permanent power in the workplace. And so we created a sister organization that became part of the Service Employees Union. And so you could you know, you could make your choice. Do you want to be in the association where we could wage this public fight, or do you want to join the union? And that's where you can gain real power in your workplace. Mm-hmm.
And then you basically switched over to the SEIU?
Well, I ran both for most of those years. And that was one of the ways that we kept the two organizations so closely tied as a single strategy. So we started the union actually in Boston in 1975. We started 9 to 5 in 1973. The union, which we called Local 925, and then ultimately District 925 when it became national, was a 75. And so I was the director of both of those organizations up until 1993, when I joined the Clinton administration.
Well, how is that possible to do both? I mean, I'm really curious about that.
It's possible because we had such a fantastic team. We had such fantastic organizers, and we had a culture of doing everything together, and no one was a star, and everybody, you know, our successes belonged to everybody, and our failures were ones that we shared as well. So it was a way of organizing that encouraged leadership and dispersed power. And so it meant that I could do my job, which was to keep the organizations in tandem and work with the union leadership and, you know, very different worlds, while these organizations with 25 chapters were continuing to do awesome work on the ground.
So when you say very different world, I mean, obviously the unions in those earlier years were men and men's jobs. Were you one of the only women to be running a whole district?
Yeah. So when we started, there were a few other women who would, it was a period when younger organizers who came out of the anti-war movement and the women's movement were going into unions, but it was almost entirely male leadership. And in my region, the Midwest region of SEIU, I think I was the only woman who ran a union. And part of our deal with SEIU was that we weren't going to just become organizers with some other local, but we were going to we would get a charter to start our own organization. We would make all the decisions about it and control our own money and, build the organization from the ground up, which was actually a big deal because we didn't start with any members. We were able to get the SEIU to take a bet on us that we would do a good job of organizing. And in fact, we had as good a win record as any other union over those years in the SEIU.
So what was the advantage of being also connected to SEIU over just the association?
Well, it meant that so for example, one time we went to as 9 to 5 in Boston, we went to a publishing house and we demanded maternity benefits. One of our members from there was pregnant and there were no maternity benefits. And so we met with management. We had 8 of our members go meet with management, and they said, oh, we'll take that under advisement and get back to you. And they never got back to us. And we thought, that's terrible. There should be something that forces them to get back to us. And we realized, oh yeah, there is. It's called the National Labor Relations Act. That if you want power in the workplace, organize a majority in the workplace, and the employer is obligated to bargain with you. And so we realized that it wasn't good enough to gin up for a fight on a single issue, even win it, and then you'd have to start all over again. But to have permanent power in a workplace that could have your voice represented all the time and could solve problems as they came up and could help determine what the working conditions would be like, that's very different than you get out of any association. And so we wanted that kind of power. And we were on a roll, Judy. We were, I've been thinking about it recently because of Mrs. America on television and the fight for the ERA. And 9 to 5, there was like zero backlash from women. It's not like there were people who were organizing counter protests to 9 to 5, to the idea of rights and respect. That wasn't happening anywhere. And so we had this very big appeal. What we didn't realize we were going to slam right into was this massive corporate response that was part of an anti-union wave that began in the mid-70s and really took hold in the 1980s. And so we had every reason to think that we were going to have a big success. And in fact, in 1980, that's when we announced that we would become a national union as part of SEIU. And that announcement was the very same week as the PATCO strike and the lockout by Reagan. So these two trends just crashed into each other. Women workers demanding a voice on the job, and corporations not having anything with it. Forget it. We're on the low road. We're going to take away benefits, lower pay. We'll give some women the opportunity to advance. That doesn't cost us much. But otherwise, we're going to split the workforce. Some women will become professionals and managers. The majority will go into even more insecure, lower paid jobs without benefits. And we're going to do that to the men too. And that's really the story of the 1980s.
You're obviously recouped as we moved into the 90s.
Well, in fact, unionizing took a nosedive during those years. And so did, in many ways, working women's organizations. So what you had starting in the mid-70s, but really taking hold in the 80s, is a major shift in corporate strategy where they decide they're going to compete globally, not on the high end with countries like Japan or Germany or the Nordic countries with better educated workforces that have better pay and more security, but instead with Korea and low-wage workforces. And so that's a major shift in corporate strategy. They go on a big union busting spree, taking out what had been formerly highly unionized work industries, including auto, which became less unionized by moving their plants to the south, meat packing, other kinds of factory work. And so there's this massive attack on unions. And then the greatest symbol, of course, is the lockout by Reagan with PACO, which just says, it's open season, take them out. We don't actually have labor management cooperation at all. We don't even have to pretend to. So that's all happening. And at the same time, what you see is a shift from the experience that I had in the late 60s and the mid 70s of, if you've got a problem, start an organization. And maybe the organization is you and your 4 best friends, but that's how you solve a problem. To an increasingly individual approach. And so you have women who, in a broad characterization, please excuse me,
Right.
from my era, who feel like, who am I? I can't do anything. It is recessive in our families, in our institutions like schools, and in our workplaces. And over that time, women become increasingly self-reliant, but less powerful, because the bottom is taken out from organization. Over those years, I would talk with women, and we would have focus groups and other ways of gauging public opinion. And when we first started 9 to 5, you'd say to women, so if you've got a problem on the job, what do you do about it? And that people might say, well, I might call now, or I could call 9 to 5, or maybe my congressperson or the mayor could help me. You'd think about institutions. And then, 10 years later, you'd ask, and people say, well, I'd talk to my coworkers. And then over time, people would be more likely to say, well, I'd call my mother, or I pray to God.
Oh,
And then by 2000, women were just saying, I just rely on myself. And so you had this change in consciousness that takes collective action out of the equation over the same period that big corporations are totally upending the way the economy is going to work and in whose interests. And you also have a cratering of women's organizations, both on the kind of local, women's karate class level, but also where you end up largely with abortion rights organizations as the only big mass organizations, and now, but at ever reduced size and power.
Mm-hmm.
So the story over all of those years is disempowerment of women, but also of working people, and those without, of every stripe, over those years.
Mm-hmm. Well, how did your union do then?
And we were good organizers, but the big campaigns were, I'll give you a couple of examples.
Good.
We organized a radio station, and we thought of this as a local radio station, and it had 35 employees, and that was easy. We got a majority easily. But then they hired the biggest union busting law firm in New York City. Alfred T. DeMoria was the name of the lawyer, who himself personally came to Boston to run the anti-union campaign. And we lost because it just becomes overwhelming. I once went to my labor lawyer's office because we'd had some other thing where we were getting smashed by some union busting firm. And I ran into an organizer with the Electrical Workers Union, the IBEW, and he says, yeah, boy, you guys run into trouble all the time. That doesn't happen to us. You know, we don't get beat up. And that's because they were in an industry that had, you know, 30 years of collective bargaining relationships with their employers. And so what had been the norm was no longer the norm. And no employer wanted to allow unionization to take hold in a brand new industry, which was the biggest industry in the country. And that was, you know, industrial group, which was clerical workers.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, the union ended up with around 20,000 members, but that wasn't enough in a new union world where really you needed to have 100,000 members to be a successful local union. Actually, it wasn't my idea, but the president of SEIU, John Sweeney, asked me if I'd be interested in trying to get the job as the director of the Women's Bureau in the U.S. Department of Labor. And so I agreed, and we put my name forward, and Robert Reich, who was the new Secretary of Labor, hired me. And that was just a lot of fun. It was just tremendous. You know, the Women's Bureau is a real backwater. It doesn't have a mandate. There's not we don't enforce a law like most of the other agencies within the Department of Labor. But that also gave us this freedom to do whatever we wanted to do. And so we just did all of this amazing outreach to women in every single kind of job all around the country. I met with women in, I don't know, 40 cities, every kind of work, flight attendants and aerospace workers and daycare workers and grocery store clerks and just everything. We did this massive survey called Working Women Count. And because we were the federal government, we got daily newspapers all around the country to run our survey. And we had 1,000 organizations that helped distribute it. And it was in 10 different languages, and 300,000 women responded to it. And I mean, it was the biggest survey outside of the US Census probably that had ever taken place. And it set an agenda. Again, this is the story of my life. What can I tell you, Judy? We're moving along, and then something really bad happens, like corporate power, or in this case, Clinton loses the midterm elections big, and you know, there's no way to move any legislative agenda because the Republicans have taken over the House and the Senate. But then we also got to intervene, and you know, I held a hearing for cocktail waitresses in Las Vegas about the problems in their industry, and we met with management, the community, and the workers in who were on strike at a walnut factory in Northern California. So we were able to highlight and intervene and bring light to this wide array of women and bring the power of the federal government behind us. So that was great. But then by '96, there had been a big fight within the labor movement. And really, I'm an organizer. That's what I most like to do. And and there was a new kind of an insurgent team that was taking over at the AFL-CIO, led by John Sweeney, who had been the president of SEIU. And so I came over to the AFL-CIO to start a working women's department and do those same kind of things that I had done at the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor, but this time from the perch of organizing working women.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back just to a minute. You said you had an agenda, which unfortunately didn't happen, but do you remember anything specific about the agenda?
Oh yeah, well, equal pay, number one.
Okay. There's always that.
Yeah, you know, in those years, maybe we were like 78 cents on the dollar, you know, it was up from 57 cents on the dollar. I don't know what it was, but it was still really low. the issues around work and family were urgent, and we had a big focus on childcare, and would have moved a big childcare agenda if we'd had the House and the Senate. Uh, Other kind, more control over work hours. I mean, there was this whole set of issues that were around the fact that women were now expected to work. Women were recognized as workers, but still expected to still run the home and the kids,
Right.
and take care of everything. So pensions, retirement security, healthcare. I mean, it was the host of issues that really haven't changed, I'm so sorry to say, and discrimination in hiring and promotion that have remained the same over my long career.
So let's go back then to now you're at the AFL-CIO.
The AFL-CIO is the federation of 50 or so unions. The unions do the organizing, and what we did was helped the unions collaborate, help bring the issues of women more to the fore within the trade union movement, and as public policy issues and so on. But again, so this was in '96, and there was a big wave of organizing. But then again, you hit the barrier of the stolen election in 2000, when Bush becomes president, unbelievably, and it just intensifies the attack on unions. And then you get 9/11 not long after that, and everything shuts down. There's no political space for anything for 3 or 4 years. But in that time, over that time, in the first Bush administration, when we're still kind of reeling from the political ice age of the war on terror, we started a new organization at the AFL-CIO, which we called Working America, because we could see that there was an opportunity to restart a conversation with working people who a generation earlier would likely have been in unions if there hadn't been this big attack on unions. But without the structure of unions, were easy prey to a right-wing social agenda. And so we did this massive organizing in working class communities by going door to door, to the doors of people who didn't have a union on the job, to have a conversation with people about their most important economic issues and how they felt about them. And over the last 17 years, we've built Working America into an organization with 3.5 million members. None of them are union members. In working class communities, about 75% are white working class. The other 25% are people of color. And they're all people who otherwise wouldn't be hearing from the progressive movement. And I think of this as 9 to 5 with men and resources. That it's the same idea of, and a majority of our members are women, 55% probably, but the same idea of start fresh, open your door, let people in, and start a new conversation with people that resets expectations and doesn't get you into these culture wars or political wars that keep so many people out of our movement.
Wow, that's a hard job, I imagine.
But it really works. I mean, it makes me the most optimistic person I know, and I'm the one who's in daily conversation with Trump voters, because we can see that it's there if you treat people with respect. And that's what 9 to 5 was about. That's what Working America is about. And I think that's where you have to start if what you want to do is build a big base of support for your ideas.
So is there more female leadership now in unions and in your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. leaders of the three biggest unions. They're all public sector unions, but the three biggest unions in the country are all women. Randy Weingarten, who's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, Lily Eskelsen Garcia, who's the head of the NEA, the National Education Association, and Mary Kay Henry, who's the head of SEIU. There are not, there are some more women who are heads of unions, but it's not like 50-50. There's still a long way to go, but you'll find women both in leadership at other levels within the organizations, and women, I think right about now, are going to are half of the membership of unions. So there's still a lot of structural change that needs to take place, but a lot of progress has been made.
And do you see unionism picking up now about that?
Yes, and we noticed this a couple of years ago when, and part of this is the degradation of middle-class work, which has been taking place over the last 10, 15 years. You know, there aren't stable jobs anymore, that the growth of the gig economy, where, you know, where now teachers, in order to make ends meet, are driving Ubers or working weekends as a grocery store clerks. So that what were middle-class jobs no longer support middle-class lives. And so there's been a realignment over the last 10 years or so of what, you know, in the old days we would call class consciousness. You know, the how do you think of yourself? And people who used to think of themselves as middle class, they don't think of themselves as middle class anymore because it's not their lived day-to-day experience. And so that changes, when your identity changes, it makes you more open to changing the world, seeing the world around you differently, and coming up with different solutions. And I think as a result, we now see the highest approval rating for unions in the last 50 years. 60% of Americans say that they favor unions, and, you know, and even higher numbers of people who are non-managerial support unions or say that they would join a union tomorrow if they could. Now, that's great. And you see things like the Fight for 15, where, you know, what fast food worker doesn't think they need more power on the job? They all do, you know. But you still have a labor law that is so stacked against working people that it's really almost impossible to win a union election, particularly with a big, either a multinational or you know, big national organization. And so we have the worst labor law in the West. There's no one in an industrialized country that has to go through anti-union campaigns. Just start from there. The employer doesn't have a say whether you, worker, should decide to be in a union or not. In every other country, that decision, it's like, what church do you want to belong to? Does your employer get to tell you what church you belong to? Well, why should the employer get to tell you whether you belong to a union or not? And that's the standard. So the employer doesn't have a say in every other developed country except the United States. And so we need to just modernize our labor law so that what working people want becomes part of the mix. And let's go back to the 80s for just a second. The reason we don't have this is because the Democratic Party, which used to be aligned with working people through the 50s and 60s, decided to, you know, leave us at the dance and do their business with corporate money. And so the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians over the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s soon came to collect as much corporate money as the Republicans. And so there wasn't while there was a lot of lip service to unions, even when there was a supermajority in the Senate in the first Obama election, you couldn't pass labor law reform, which would have been the most important legislation to have made economic change in this country. But it hasn't happened over all those years. And if the Democrats don't do it, if Biden wins, then all of us will continue to suffer in an economy that does just what's happening right now in the pandemic, which is not care one bit to what's happening for most working people.
What are you doing these days?
Well, I retired a couple of years ago. I'm still very active with Working America. I'm on the board, and we've got a big volunteer group, and so I'm doing the parts of the job that I always like the most, and not the parts that are too much work. And there's a fantastic new leader, and he's, you know, much better at the things that you need to be good at now. He understands all the analytics. He's actually a real leader in the world of analytics, and so I get to throw in my organizing expertise as a board member. But and I'm, you know, like a citizen of my country. I go to the protests. I'm one of these, you know, our powerful grannies all over the country, right? Who are like the backbone of all the organizing that's going on. So I show up. That's what I do.
Right. And how do you see the future for those women workers that you've always cared so much about?
Well, I do think that the potential is certainly better now than it has been, that people are much more in a fighting frame of mind, and that the horrible circumstances that most working people find themselves in creates a new possibility for different solutions. But I just think we have massively powerful adversaries, and that we have to be both excellent organizers and sophisticated about what we're up against in order to make progress. And then the other thing is that I just want to emphasize the failure of the progressive movement to appreciate the importance of unions. And I don't mean unions, oh yeah, those, you know, letters for the, you know, IAM and IUE. I mean this idea that working people come together in their workplace and they live democracy. They work out their differences, they vote, they control their dues, they elect their leaders. This is an experience of democracy that has been wiped out of most of our communities. We don't, all of those wonderful community organizations which used to power civic life don't exist anymore. The union movement in the United States is the biggest women's organization in the country. It's the biggest multiracial organization in the country. It's the biggest cross-class, and maybe, you know, like one of the only cross-class institutions in this country. If people have different experiences with race, with what they're entitled to, with politics, they can hear each other out in a local union and become friends and respect each other's point of view and come together. And if we don't have those institutions, we have an economy like what we have today, where people can barely survive, and we have a democracy like we have today, which is barely surviving either. And so we have to build democratic institutions, including and most importantly in the workplace.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No,
You
that's
got it. Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't know, you know, like I have been so lucky. You know, I have been, you know, I've had the opportunity to fight the good fight my whole life, and to do that with wonderful people. And and that's about joining together with other people. So I recommend it.
Right. Okay. Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.